Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest. October 31st, 2024, the Floating Island of Garbage edition. I am David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C., from New Haven, Connecticut, where she's had travails voting, from Yale University. Laws.
No, don't say that. It was great. I loved it. Every second of it. Everyone should go do it.
I guess that your state put obstacles in the way of you voting even more easily than you would have otherwise, Emily Bazelon.
Okay, I had to wait a little while. Everything was wonderful.
And that peal of laughter, of course, is from John Dickerson of CBS News in New York City. Hello, John.
Oh, hello.
This week on the Gabfest, oh my God, it's the final week of the presidential campaign. What matters? Where do we stand? Then Nate Persley of Stanford is going to join us to talk through what might be done to subvert the election results, what legal action is taking place around the polls, and what we should worry about and what we shouldn't worry about. Then the Washington Post trips all over itself when it declines to endorse a presidential candidate. We will discuss. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter and a reminder that we have a live show coming up in Brooklyn at the Bell House in Brooklyn on Wednesday, December 4th. And it's our annual Conundrums show. You can get tickets at slate.com/Gabfest live. There's still tickets available. There's some amazing questions. You become city planner for your city or town. You receive federal funding for a large infrastructure project. How would you use it? John Dickerson, if you could be a fly on the wall in the Oval Office for a 2-week period in history, what 2 weeks would it be?
Oh, man, that's a good one. Wow. That's so good.
Yeah, there you go. If dogs lived approximately 7 times as long as humans rather than vice versa, how would our relationship with them change?
These are amazing. Oh my God. People's minds are so imaginative.
Amazing, amazing questions. Well, you will hear those amazing questions and more if you come to our live show in Brooklyn on December 4th. Get tickets, slate.com/Gabfest live. And if you have other conundrums for us to consider, please submit them at slate.com/conundrum. It is said that the two candidates are making their closing arguments or have made their closing arguments this week. Trump with an insane, riotous, vicious Bundist rally at Madison Square Garden. Harris with a traditional speech on the Ellipse, the site of Trump's own January 6th speech. We're going to talk about the final days of this strange and tense and close presidential campaign. But first, John, I actually have a question. Maybe it's a trivial question. Why do people talk about closing arguments? What is a closing? Why is that a thing? There's still days to go in this campaign. There are lots of appearances. Why is there even the idea that, they have made their closing argument? I don't get that.
It's a vestige. I couldn't agree with you more. It's a vestige of when there was an election day. I mean, in other words, you make your closing argument and then everybody, then the jury goes to deliberate and cast their vote on election day. Well, this closing argument has taken place after a third of the voting has already taken place. Then, as you point out, why is a closing argument given a week before the actual election day considered a closing argument? Why isn't it 3 days before? I think the answer to that is that it has to, if it's a closing argument you hope will be effective at all, and we can talk about whether it is possible to make it be effective, it has to happen while people are voting in early voting or take enough time to get into the bloodstream in a way that it might not if you did it on Monday, say, the day before the election. But then the larger question to me is, how do you even talk about closing arguments in a campaign like this one? I've used the analogy before, but there's a lot of ways in which we're covering this campaign like it's a normal campaign, like, say we're doing analysis of a chess match, but the chess match is taking place on the Titanic. I mean, this campaign is taking place in an atmosphere where one of the candidates, what was the one moment of bipartisan agreement in January of 2021? That the Republican candidate was the first president ever to try to overthrow an election. Like, that was the consensus. And now I know Kamala Harris was obviously trying to revive that focus with her closing argument. But I mean, this is not a normal campaign. So closing arguments, and as you pointed out, Trump's is not so much of an argument as it is a kind of howl. It's just that even using normal terminology to me has the risk of forgetting for a moment how different this campaign is.
Emily, is there any reason to think that Trump's garden spectacle will help or hurt him?
I mean, it seemed like the racist remark from Tony Hinchcliffe, the comedian, about Puerto Ricans broke through. Like that, Bad Bunny and other Puerto Rican celebrities were really offended, put out social media posts that got gazillion views.
Es una historia que se empezó a escribir incluso antes de que Irán Bison fuera el primero en pichear y de que Roberto Clemente y Peruchín Cepeda le hablaran español al universo.
Al día más grande de mi vida, para los nenes, la bendición mía y que mis padres me echen mi bendición en Puerto Rico.
Se escribe antes de que se volviera inmortal todo esto. Desde Cooperstown,
desde mi querido Vega Baja y la isla del encanto Puerto Rico,
hasta Dorado, donde Edgar y Yadier todavía hacen sueño. De hecho, es una historia.
Then, there are a lot of Puerto Ricans who live in Pennsylvania, and also states like Florida. It seems like there's some evidence that when it's your particular group that gets completely insulted and shafted like that might make you think twice. But I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I was reminded that when Trump was president, he insulted Puerto Rico by complaining about the relief efforts after the hurricane and like throwing rolls of paper towels at people. And he still got a significant share of the Puerto Rican vote. So, we'll have to see whether those things matter. Certainly it didn't help him, right? It was like a huge own goal. All the coverage from it was about how, excessive and angry and insulting and misogynist a lot of the speakers were. And there's just a darkness that he seems to be embracing right now. I guess one thing I've been wondering about, over the summer, there was a time when Trump shrank. He just seemed smaller and there was more making fun of him. He seemed less significant. And now I feel like he's looming large again. And in that sense, the Madison Square Garden rally is part of that kind of looming darkness threat. And there are some people, who are Trump supporters who like that. He's a bully, but he's our bully. I'm unclear about how that dynamic plays out, obviously, because this just seems like it's super close. And, if he loses by a teeny bit, it'll seem like he made a big mistake. And if he wins by a tiny bit, then it'll seem like, well, all right, even though actually it's going to be a small distinction either way, presumably.
I would add briefly that there's this other weird thing that's happening, which is Kamala Harris is saying he behaves in all these ways. And then he holds a rally in which the people surrounding him and the whole vibe is consistent with the criticisms that she's making of him.
Yeah.
He's putting all of his chips on a very certain kind of voter. Harris is putting her chips on trying to pull over some voters who might still be reluctant about her. I was struck that in her closing argument, she was still explaining who she was. He's, accused of being a fascist. And then he says, well, let me tell you how I'm going to use the military against my political enemies. He's going into the criticism of him as he finishes his campaign.
Are we seeing anything, John, in the early voting that should have Democrats or Republicans concerned or confused? Is there anything we can discern just from the amount of voting where it's taking place that indicates anything? Or is it just impossible to know because 2024 is different from 2020? States have changed their rules. The campaigns have changed their approach, and therefore reading too much into the number of ballots cast and which party has cast them is it's oracular. It's Delphic.
I think it's the latter. I think when we get a final result, people will say, oh, you could tell because in the early vote. But we don't know whether, say, all the Republicans who are choosing to vote early are the party essentially cannibalizing its day of vote. There are traditions about who votes on election day and who votes early. Those may have changed. There may be more Republicans voting early, not listening to their candidate about earlier mail-in voting. And there may be more Democrats who voted by mail or absentee or however in 2020 during COVID, who this time will go and vote in person. There's definitely a lot of people who feel, I want to see it in my hand, giving it to a poll worker who might not have felt that way who might have said, sure, but there's a pandemic, so I'm not going to. So the answer is, I don't think we know. We know that a lot of people are voting.
Emily, what is it that you are going to do? We're gonna have a Slate Plus segment. Our Slate Plus segment is going to be how to productively spend the next few days without making yourself crazy. But I guess I'm wondering what you, as a person who professionally has to observe this, is there anything that you're going to be looking for in the next few days to tell you anything? Or do you just think that's a fool's errand and we should just not even bother to try to read into anything?
Yeah, I do think it's mostly a fool's errand. I do wonder what you guys think about the significance of President Biden's apparent misstatement when he said that Trump supporters were garbage, although then he says he really meant that the demonization of Trump supporters at the rally was the garbage he was referring to. But he created a clip that was open to misinterpretation, which then a whole bunch of Republicans, including Trump, of course, immediately seized on.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of things is unconscionable, and it's un-American.
And I wonder if you think that that is broken through in the same way that some of the ugly rhetoric at the rally did.
If you were a voter who is likely to take umbrage at that comment, my guess is we're already steamed enough to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. So I don't think the umbrage taking is probably going to have that much of an effect. Also, it's not the candidate. I know, so there's some distance there. I also think that one of the reasons these things work or don't work is, are they consistent with a general view of the candidate? So Donald Trump didn't say, it was some comedian. Now, first of all, why do you book a comedian who's going to say that kind of stuff and vet his remarks beforehand? So that's a dumb
vet
defense.
them and let that one go through.
They did apparently vet and knock out calling Kamala Harris the C word, preserving the dignity of the presidency.
Though Elon Musk, in an ad his PAC paid for, is totally playing with the C word. So it's not like they've let go of that particular insult. Continue.
But the question for voters is, which candidate is this closer to the true heart of, as you think about the two candidates? Is it more likely that Donald Trump has the view expressed by the comedian, or that Kamala Harris thinks this about Trump voters? I mean, because it's going to matter what they think about their fellow Americans when they're making policy, or choosing not to make policy, or choosing to care about things. I do think, however, that to the extent that there's a news cycle anymore, Harris's closing argument was designed and pitched very carefully towards Republicans. And it was very kind of middle of the road. It was had the rough edges shaved off about MAGA and all that. It was clearly designed to do the opposite, also almost metaphysical opposite of what Biden did in his remark. So it ain't nothing that on the day she is trying to zig, he is making the story the zag.
What do you guys make of the exceptional confidence that is infused in right-wing media that Trump is going to win? Do you think that is just the kind of epistemological iron sphere that everyone's trapped in, that they just believe, they've chosen to believe, and that they live in a world where belief is the only permissible outcome? Do you think it is an intentional strategy to set the groundwork for, in case Trump loses, to weaken the Kamala Harris's victory and make it possible to undermine the victory? Or do you think it reflects an actual reality, which is that there's evidence that things are going better for Trump and he's more likely to win?
I would say some combination of 1 and 2, and not really 3. 3 doesn't seem like empirical and reality based. I mean, it's possible it will turn out that the polls are slightly wrong in Trump's, and that will favor Trump, and he will win, somewhat handily. But I think that it just feels like all of a piece to me that in these kinds of relatively sealed off self-confident bubbles, and they exist in a different way among liberals. Like, they're not, I don't think that you have the same hyper confidence, but I think you have the same echo chamber problem in different ways. Once you're in that
2016, world, the left had that problem. They did have that problem. Yeah.
100%.
I was in that, fell victim to that myself.
Yeah. I mean, I just mostly want to make clear, I think that liberals have their own echo chambers right now. It just doesn't seem to be this particular one. And I think it absolutely does lay the groundwork for sowing doubt after the election. And there seems to be a kind of determination to do that. I mean, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is like playing footsie with like, oh, we have some secret deal going on, me and President Trump, former President Trump. And, oh, no, now I'm just talking about get out the vote. I don't know why you guys all freaked out that I might have meant something about subverting the election. But like he was totally messing around with that idea. And I feel like we're seeing that in a lot of ways. That I think this is maybe the thing that distresses me the most is being so cavalier and so willing to sow doubt and undermine the just like basic tenets of the democracy. The idea that like it's no big deal to challenge election results, not in a restrained, sober, like I really have my evidence lined up, I'm going to court sort of way, but just in a like, well, there must be something wrong, and I'm just going to throw up all the chaff, and that's what it means to have an election in the United States of America for the presidency right now. I'm just like ready to make everybody think I'm not going to accept the results if I lose. It is shocking. Like, how did we get here? This is bad.
We should also remember that Liz Cheney says that Speaker Johnson was an active participant in trying to overthrow the last election. Like, in other words, he, as the author of the effort in the House to help Trump reverse those votes of 81 million people, he wasn't just a member of the House. He was actively participating and saying things that he knew or should have known not to be true.
I want to close on the celebrity question. There's so many celebrities who've come out for Harris: Beyonce, Swift, J-Lo, Bad Bunny, Willie Nelson, Insane Clown Posse,
James
Usher,
Taylor, don't forget,
John Legend, Cardi B, Kesha, Chappell Roan, Bruce Springsteen. Every actor who's not Mel Gibson. Emily, you've made a lot of hay about how annoying that was in 2016, or you've talked about how it seems to have it backfired on Clinton in 2016. Do you think it is possibly going to backfire on Harris in the same way, or do these celebrities add something? They create really fun occasions for a rally, for example.
I mean, I think they're great for supporters. I just don't think that it translates beyond that. I don't think people are like, oh, Taylor Swift is going to do this, so maybe I will. I don't know. Maybe a few people, because she has so many young there was that
fans. Upsurge in voter registration that people attributed to her endorsement.
Right, but then somebody did the math about like how many people per state that really might have translated to, and like it just seemed, I don't know. Look, I mean, Swift is a particular phenomenon, so maybe she wasn't the best person for me to make my case about this. My concern is about people feeling talked down to and told what to do and condescended to when that message is coming from what appears to be the liberal elite. That was my concern about President Biden's misstatement, was that for some people, like, that is what they assume that people, Democrats, elites are saying about them and thinking about them. And so I think it's really important for celebrities to respect that everybody needs to be making their own decision. And like, sure, it's fine to say, these are the things I care about, these are my values in either direction. But I think anything that seems like I have the privilege to tell you what to do can easily become a source of resentment and kind of backfire.
I think what you say is exactly right. I wondered if you heard that in any of the endorsements, or whether it's like, because there was some preach in some of the endorsements, and others were there to just be like, it's a party. We're all excited for Kamala Harris, and I'm here to join the party.
Yeah, I think that you're right, John. I mean, I've been a little concerned about the Obamas on this front, honestly. Like, Michelle Obama has been super impassioned this week. I wonder if she's changing minds.
I also wonder whether any of this, I mean, obviously part of the goal here is to break through to super low propensity, low information, not paying attention to the campaign kinds of voters. And if this bounces onto their radar for a minute, maybe it engages them. Who knows? I think also it's like, the only thing you can do is everything you can do, which is what I'm now quoting Dan Harris, quoting David Axelrod from, I can't remember which election, maybe 2012. I mean, at the end, you just like, everybody wants to have done everything they possibly could. And I think celebrities kind of fall into that category as well.
Yes, Hulk Hogan has definitely been on that train. I mean, I do think that when you see an endorsement from someone like Bad Bunny that doesn't seem like it was planned, like he just got mad and went and made a video, that has a different ring to it.
Planned Parenthood Federation of America exists so that all people can get access to the sexual and reproductive care and education they need to make informed decisions about their health. More than 2 million patients a year rely on the services Planned Parenthood health centers provide, like STI testing and treatment, birth control, gender-affirming care, abortion, cancer screenings, and so much more. Right now, all across the country, reproductive health care and rights are under attack from public officials who are out of step with the will of the vast majority of Americans. The constitutional right to abortion, control of our bodies, and the health care we need has been stolen from us. And now politicians in 47 states, yes, 47, have introduced bills that would block people from getting the sexual and reproductive care they need. Planned Parenthood knows that equitable access to health care, including safe, legal abortion, is a human right. Right now, Planned Parenthood needs your help to protect access to health care. Donate today by visiting PlannedParenthood.org/protect.
This episode is sponsored by the NRDC. The planet is changing at an alarming rate, but the blame doesn't fall equally on everyone. Just a few corporations are responsible for a majority of the pollution. The Natural Resources Defense Council is fighting to stop polluters in and out of court because the survival of our planet and humanity depends on it. Donate at nrdc.org/podcast. You'll back their team of lawyers and scientists and keep them fighting in and out of court to stop polluters and protect our one and only planet. There's a reason why the Wall Street Journal said they're the most effective litigating group on environmental issues, because when they have your support, they win. Donate at nrdc.org/podcast. The Gabfest is supported by The World As You'll Know It, a podcast about the forces shaping our future. In the midst of an election that has been incredibly complicated and contentious and difficult, it's easy to forget about one of the most consequential challenges our next president will face: balancing our energy needs with climate goals. In this season of The World As You'll Know It, host and science journalist Ariel Doom-Ross goes deep inside the revolution to replace fossil fuels with clean energy sources. You'll meet the scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs staking their careers on this effort and discover the places where new technologies like green hydrogen, carbon capture, and next-gen batteries are having the most impact. It is an unprecedented challenge, and the stories are fascinating. Tune in for the great rebuild on this season of The World As You'll Know It, available wherever you get your podcasts. We're joined by Nate Persley, professor at Stanford University Law School, the world's living authority on election law and election interference. I personally, Nate, am just triggered by the word Nate these days.
You and my family both.
It's like Silver, Cone, Persley. You are definitely the least triggering of the Nates. But
something wicked this Nate comes.
Oh.
But here you are coming to talk to us about possible threats to the election, how Trump presumably could try to overturn a law. So can we start with two basic questions? Which scenarios are you no longer worried about for this election? And then which scenarios are you extremely worried about? And we'll get into details on both of those, or certainly on the second category.
There are so many scenarios that people had sort of proffered that I don't think are serious problems. I'll just mention a few, and one that I think people are still taking seriously, which is, for example, that local election officials are not going to certify the election, and somehow that's going to hold up the result. I am convinced that, we have the legal tools in our toolbox to deal with that problem. You're not going to have these local officials that have been, written about recently, who, stick their fingers in their ears and say, we're not going to certify the election. That's going to prevent this from happening. The courts will deal with that. It'll be inconvenient. I don't see the secretaries of state or the governors in the battleground states refusing to certify the election. So that worst case scenario, I think, is off the table. I'm more concerned about, what we're seeing right now, principally in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is to 2024 what Florida was in 2000, and that is just a series of accusations about inaccuracies in the voter rolls and claims of fraud and rigging, and then also different rules in different counties as to how people can cure mistakes. So that's the thing that I'm focused on. It might be a little more mundane, but if you had to predict what's the big issue, I think that's one of them.
Are there outstanding court decisions, like continuing litigation floating around in Pennsylvania, Nate, or is it the current status quo that's bothering you?
There are multiple lawsuits being filed every day in Pennsylvania right now. And it's still the case. And we are waiting for the U.S. Supreme Court actually to weigh in on one question related to the curing of absentee ballots, which I do think is a potential issue in this election.
What is curing ballots?
Curing a ballot is if you submit an absentee ballot and it has a flaw, like you didn't date it or you didn't sign it, etc., whether you have the chance to come in and fix your mistake so that it can be properly counted.
Just to sort of level set what I think the main issues are, and they come up in many different forms in Pennsylvania, is whether people can cast absentee ballots and whether errors that are found in the absentee ballots, for example, whether they don't come in with a date or whether there are mistakes, whether those can be cured by voters, basically correcting mistakes after the fact. And then there'd be a period of days even after the election where that might potentially happen. But there's a lot of conflict among the locals as to whether they offer that option, and there's some inconsistency. And so those of us who watched in 2000 how the issue there was inconsistent application of recount standards, that's an issue that I think is emerging in Pennsylvania.
Nate, can you walk us through what you see as the levels of or the different kinds of mischief? So what I mean is, so we know we have like deep fakes out there about things that aren't happening at various polling places. That's a sort of visual element. Then we have what you're talking about, which is inconsistencies in rule application, which might be a legitimate kernel of confusion, but which is amped up. Confusion is amped up for the purposes of sowing chaos. Is it possible to categorize so that, I mean, I'm thinking about this in a very utilitarian sense, which is so that on election night or leading up to it, we all can say, okay, that slots into this known act of bad faith acting.
Right. So let me just start by saying that the election is already underway. Probably close to a third of the population has already voted. We have not seen major problems. That the early voting serves as a good warning system for other kinds of problems, whether you're worried about foreign interference, machine breakdowns, problems with the voter list. So things are going well. And so the criticisms that are being made are, I think, more about creating doubt in the pre-election period that can preserve possible objections in the post-election period. So having said all that, again, some of the things that I'm not worried about are some of the things you described. So, the pollution of the information ecosystem by AI-generated deep fakes, I just don't think that's going to be a big deal. Not because the information ecosystem is terribly healthy, but there's just so much crap that's out there already that the additional move that happens with AI, I don't think it is significant. Again, there's no shortage of disinformation, but in some ways that's baked into the system. What I'm worried about are claims like we've seen in the last few days. Donald Trump said that there were thousands of fraudulent absentee ballots in Lancaster and York counties, when it was just that the election officials did what they always do, which is that they found some mistakes in an effort to register voters or to file absentee ballot applications. And the system is working, but when the system is working and discovers these kinds of errors, it's accused of being rigged and faulty. And so I'm worried about that kind of doubt that's being created. As well as, claims of disenfranchisement. I don't know if people saw, but in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, there was, an accusation that Republican voters were not being allowed to vote in this sort of early voting period that Pennsylvania has.
Nate, one thing I'm having a hard time connecting is that, so there's all these accusations, and presumably there'll be all these legal claims that things are inconsistent or things are unfair or these ballots were counted and these weren't. How does that translate into an actual effort to overturn an election result? How does that chaos and mischief lead to actually Pennsylvania's vote is given to a candidate who hasn't earned it?
Well, the way that we will have a controversy is that the election will be close enough that a bucket of disputed ballots will determine the outcome. And so there are two sort of types of buckets that I would focus on. One is disputed absentee ballots, saying that for one reason or another, these absentee ballots shouldn't be counted. And to be clear, there are already thousands of ballots we know that are kind of in this gray area or in this twilight zone. For example, those that were received in Philadelphia that don't have a date on them. And the second is what we call provisional ballots. And those are the ballots that voters, when they come in to the polling place and there's some issue with their registration, then they cast these ballots that are adjudicated after the election. And so if you have a very close election and, possibility that these ballots could go one way or the other, that's the recipe for contestation. Now, I'm still not I disagree with those who say that there's the likelihood that someone's going to overturn the election that has already, where the votes have been cast and counted. In theory, we could have a Bush versus Gore style situation where everything goes through the Pennsylvania system. The governor signs what's known as the certificate of ascertainment, and then the Supreme Court says, "Oh no, we're going to say the other candidate won." I just think that is a low probability event. I think that much more likely is you're just going to have confusion and you're going to have disagreement, and then the courts are going to have to get involved. And this is not an environment which is going to be terribly conducive to that kind of litigation. I mean, people are not really willing to put down their arms and say, all right, yes, we'll just accept what, say, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court has to say.
On Election Day on Tuesday, what should we be paying attention to? There have been reports of lots of poll workers or poll monitors really trained by the parties who are going to come in and be a big presence. And both wonder what you think is likely to actually happen, what they could do, how much trouble they could cause, and also just generally, how should the media be most responsible in reporting on Election Day and after? If there are incidents of violence or irregularity, how do we tell people what's going on without creating alarmism that could deter people from voting or just cause trouble? And this also, can you also talk about the days after, when our role is also going to be perhaps important?
So what I'm most concerned about with respect to whether it's violence or destruction of ballots is that isolated instances will suggest some kind of national or statewide trend, right? There are going to be scuffles and problems in this election. People's nerves are simply too raw. The question is whether it's part of an organized effort to affect the election outcome, so that if we see some violence in a polling place, is it part of a larger state effort to suppress the vote, or is it just, people behaving like jerks, which is undoubtedly going to happen in this election, and then is going to be blown out of proportion? This is what concerned me over the last week about these fires in the drop boxes in Washington and Oregon. Again, it was sort of an isolated instance, but it's exactly the worst case scenario that everybody is thinking about, that there's going to be some destruction of ballots and a systematic effort to try to overturn the election by destroying, voting, ballots and counting centers. And that is, for me, the worst case scenario. For those who watched the show Succession, that was the scenario they came up with in the end of, someone firebombs a Milwaukee counting facility. But I think, the election officials are prepared for that in the battleground states. And I consider that a low probability event, but it is, of course, the black swan event that we should legitimately be concerned about. And so whether it's challengers, violence, the other kinds of things you're talking about, is it an isolated instance, or is it a systematic effort to suppress the vote? Then in the days following the election, we need to communicate to the public that this is potentially going to take several days, just as it did last time, in order to count the votes. And the fact that one candidate might be leading at one point and then another candidate gets a lot of votes afterwards does not mean that there's something wrong with the system. And by the way, that goes both ways, because everybody assumes that there's going to be sort of this red mirage when the polls close, and then a blue wave as absentee ballots get counted. That is not actually a consistent story throughout the states. They count absentee ballots at different times. we will just see shifts, and that's normal when you have a lot of absentee ballots that will be counted. So that's what I would preach, which is to remain calm as the ballots are being counted. And I'll say, at some point I do feel a little bit like the Leslie Nielsen character in Naked Gun, who's standing in front of a burning building and saying, "Nothing to see here. Go along with your business." But to emphasize again, things are going well already, and we could have seen a lot of problems at this point, and we haven't, and that's a good sign.
Yeah, some of the dogs aren't barking. I when you were talking, Nate, I was reminded of what Jen Easterly, who's the head of CISA, said, which is one of the biggest dangers is not just foreign mischief, but overreaction in the U.S. to foreign mischief. That like a sense of restraint among the citizenry is one of the strongest things that can be done to retain the strength of the voting system. Can I ask you just back on the early voting? I saw Brad Raffensperger in Georgia talk about 3 million early votes. Is there any way in which, I know you've said already we haven't seen a lot of problems with that, but is there any way in which either all the early votes that have been banked lessen our chance for mayhem on election day? Or is there any way in those votes that have been banked that there might be a new round of mischief that we might not have had if so many people hadn't voted early in, say, Georgia or other places where they are?
No, I think that it's a good sign. I mean, I think that banking those votes means that sort of they're taken out of the system. It means there's possibly going to be shorter lines on election day. And, they're in secure facilities already. I mean, the big question is how many of them might be contested because there are problems. And like I said, we're seeing that in places like Pennsylvania already. But no, I think the early voting is a good sign. And it's a good sign in a particular way, which is that if you think that one of the problems here was going to be contested registrations, that illegal voters were voting, we don't see evidence of that right now. Whether it's in the in-person early voting or in the absentee voting, you don't see mass challenges to people that you might have thought. So Emily, your point about, all right, what about all these poll watchers? Well, the poll watchers could be there now, and they are there now in some of these early voting stations, and we don't see the kinds of obstruction of the vote or challenging of these voters' status that people feared.
Has there been any I know Virginia, and maybe you want to mention that, but any non-citizen challenges, or because obviously Trump has been telling this lie that thousands of non-citizens are going to be allowed to vote. Has that shown up anywhere?
We're just seeing that at the wholesale level, not the retail level, which is to say that there's all of these challenges that are being brought in court and before the relevant election authorities, saying there's massive numbers of non-citizens on the rolls. You need to do something about it. But I haven't seen any evidence that people are being challenged because of their eligibility. And one thing I should add is that if people are challenged, ultimately they're going to be able to vote a provisional ballot. And so that we would end up having to deal with that after the fact anyway.
Just note, there is one dude in Ann Arbor who, from the University of Michigan, who's Chinese, who voted illegally and is now being charged with a felony. Just full disclosure.
That poor idiot.
That guy, he apparently called in afterward to ask if his ballot could be taken out.
But I mean, that's at least like one guy who made a apparently seemingly honest mistake, as opposed to any evidence that would feed into this storyline they've been pushing in the Trump world, that there's this massive coordinated effort.
In answer to John's point about Virginia, that we had this sort of extraordinary action by the Supreme Court yesterday approving a purge of several thousand voters on the list in Virginia because these are folks who didn't check off the citizenship box, say, when they got a driver's license. And so for many people, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. It's like, why don't you take these voters off the rolls if they didn't check that box? And the answer is that a lot of people, when they're getting their driver's license, are not paying attention to this as like a voter registration exercise. And so they might not, pay attention to which boxes that they're checking. regardless of all that, the reason this case is significant is that the Supreme Court has approved a purge of voters a week before the election, which is usually a big no-no. Under the Motor Voter Law, otherwise known as the National Voter Registration Act, you're not supposed to have these systemic purges of voters within 90 days of the election. And so 1 week before the election, that's what they've done.
I was reading a story in VoteBeat this morning, which I super recommend, about an investigation by VoteBeat and ProPublica in Texas of people who'd been purged. And you were supposed to be able to get back onto the rolls and re-register. And they found people who had been purged erroneously. And some of the counties in Texas were confused and were not letting people re-register until the reporters got the Secretary of State in Texas to send them the rules. And so it just struck me as an example of how the law can be reassuring that people can cast provisional ballots and register no matter what, but it depends on the local officials in the moment to do the right thing sometimes. And that is another problem with these purges.
Well, everyone has the right to cast a provisional ballot, right? If no one should be turned away from the polls for any reason. Certainly, there are going to be local officials who try to do things like that. It happens every election. But what we learned after the 2000 election is that and with the Help America Vote Act, which created provisional ballots, is that you don't want to have in the polling place essentially litigation over the status of voters. You give them a provisional ballot, and if there's an issue, it gets resolved afterwards. And so whether it's people who don't have ID or whether their names are not on the rolls, everybody has the right to cast a provisional ballot.
Nate Persley of Stanford University Law School, thanks for coming on the Gabfest and not triggering me.
Thanks for having me.
Enlightening you instead.
This episode is brought to you by Lumen. Your metabolism is your body's engine, so optimizing your metabolic health translates to easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness, and better sleep. Introducing Lumen, the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. To use Lumen, all you have to do is breathe into your Lumen device first thing in the morning, and then the app lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. It also gives you tailored guidance on how to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. You can breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you'll know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Take the next step in improving your health. Go to lumen.me/Gabfest to get 15% off your Lumen. That's LUMEN.me/Gabfest for 15% off your purchase. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. It's officially cozy season. In my household, that is the most important of all seasons. And if the early morning chill wasn't enough to make you want to stay in bed, new bedding from Quince will help keep you warm and comfy. I just got some Quince pillowcases. I have a pillow that I love, and I just couldn't find a pillowcase that fit it. And I got a king-size pillowcase from Quince, and it has changed my sleep. My pillow, A, fits in my pillowcase, so it no longer comes out. And B, the pillow is just so soft and cozy, and I sleep so well on this pillowcase. That's because Quince sheets and pillowcases are soft and luxurious. They use high-quality materials like European linen and organic cotton to give that 5-star hotel feel. Same goes for their ultra-plush duvets, quilts, pillows, and shams, too. The best part is that, like Quince's clothing, Quince's bedding is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Because Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman, partners directly with top companies, and passes the savings on to us. So turn up the luxury when you turn in with Quince. Go to quince.com/thegabfest to get free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's QUINCE.com/thegabfest for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thegabfest.
This episode is brought to you by Saks.com. There is joy in finding the perfect gift for the ones you love, but it can be a challenge. Saks.com's Holiday Gift Guide makes it easy. Whether you're surprising your hard-to-shop fourth sister with a Chloe bracelet or gifting your partner a memorable scent from Gucci, at Saks.com, there's holiday inspiration for every personality on your list. So I went on Saks.com last night with my husband and my older son, and we were poking around for gifts for them. And we found a nice Michael Kors sweater that my kid liked, something from Ralph Lauren, and lots of themed socks, including socks with bicycles on them that looked really fun. Saks.com's hand-picked guide can help take the stress out of the holidays. Find gifts guaranteed to bring joy to everyone this holiday season at Saks.com. That's Saks.com for the ultimate holiday gift guide and all the shopping inspiration you need.
More than 250,000 people have canceled their subscriptions to the Washington Post since that newspaper announced that it would end a 48-year tradition of endorsing in the presidential race. According to reporting that I think has been widely accepted, owner Jeff Bezos made the decision after a Harris endorsement had been drafted by his editorial board. And he made it over the objections of editorial editor David Shipley and CEO Will Lewis. In an editorial published in the Post, Bezos argued that the endorsements were not worth doing because they didn't change minds and they increased mistrust in journalism, reinforcing a belief that many in America have that journalists are biased. The same week, the Los Angeles Times' billionaire owner also blocked his paper from endorsing Harris. I said blocked is the wrong word. You own the paper. You can do whatever you want.
Well, there is that. Good acknowledgement.
In both cases, critics have argued that it's preemptive capitulation. It's rich businessmen seeking to protect themselves from retaliation if Trump is reelected. I think this is such an interesting set of issues. Actually, and also just for context, I want to note that 250,000 is the same number of subscribers that the Boston Globe has in its entirety. So the Washington Post lost basically the entire business of the Boston Globe in a few days.
It's like 10% of the total subscribers for the Post.
It's an extraordinary number. So, John, was Bezos wrong to stop the Post's endorsement?
He might not have been wrong in a narrow sense. The way he handled it seems, for somebody who is one of the generation's geniuses about how to handle customers, right? Amazon is studied for its understanding of the customers, and he doesn't seem to have read the room here either in terms of Post subscribers or the journalists who work for him. I mean, so to the extent that the owner has customers in their employees, the note that he wrote explaining what he was up to seemed to miss some opportunities and in fact just actively antagonize the people who might hold a different view or who work for him. So why do I think he might narrowly be right? I think the confusion that customers have between the editorial page and the regular pages of the newspaper, that we have come across all the time. So if his larger argument is that makes the day-to-day work that the Post reporters do on the reporting side, brings it into question, then, okay, that's a totally defensible argument. Should have made it, as he acknowledged, months ago. There's a weird way in which in explaining what he did, he sort of did a sort of mistakes were made when he didn't explain why he didn't announce this news long before it became so close to the election, which I thought was a weird thing. But the opportunity I think he missed, in addition to the sort of tone that he struck, was, he could have actually laid out his argument. So he made this weird analogy to voting machines, which didn't work for me. He said basically voting machines have to be both accurate and people have to believe that they're accurate. But in the newspaper, you have a core job, which is to be accurate. And if people don't believe you, that doesn't change your core requirement to be accurate and to tell the truth. Now, as a business proposition, you have to have customers, but that's a different argument. So he sort of skipped over the core thing that journalism is supposed to do. And you wouldn't modify a voting machine's answer in order to gain credibility with the public. But what he could have said is, here are all the amazing things the Post does on the reporting side. Do that high, like second paragraph. Go and list the things they do and say that great work relies on people believing the journalists who do that work and that they're reporting it and framing it without bias. And I'm concerned that all that great work that they do, and then maybe list some stuff about the president who everybody's all freaked out about because it turns out he actually tried to overturn everybody's vote, then say, and I'm worried that great work they're doing on this side is going to be hurt by these endorsements. So that he uses his great moment where everybody's paying attention to him to lift up the underlying core thing the paper
John,
does.
auditioning for a job with Jeff Bezos.
I mean, you're
gonna be.
Here is the ball.
No, but the point is, like, it would have been very easy. I mean, John's doing a great job of laying it out, but like, did he talk to a single PR person before he published that incredibly tone-deaf, like, blaming essay? Which, I mean, I entirely agree. I think it is completely fine for newspapers to stop doing endorsements. And we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were talking about the New York Times decision not to do endorsements anymore for local and state candidates. There is confusion, and I continue to stick to my belief that in the world where newspapers were on paper and the opinion pages were in the back and there was a clear division and everyone, I think it was just easier to understand that it was like a different thing that the paper did. Now online, I think that those lines have gotten blurry, and it is confusing why, you know, newspapers claim to be nonpartisan in the newsroom and then have like a clear position editorially and opinion. I mean, I also think it's fine to keep doing that and keep doing endorsements if you want. But it was the Bezos that it was the most, you know, offense is the best defense kind of explanation. Like, who is to blame for the timing complete mess up here? Well, that would be Jeff Bezos, because he could have announced this months or even weeks ago and it would have had a totally different significance. And then to just start firing at your own journalists, like basically just like crapping all over their work and blaming them for distrust in the media. I mean, obviously, we should all think about our own flaws and the way our institutions may be losing trust from parts of the public, 100%. But in that context, to start, you know, just like firing away at everyone when the fact that you've lost all these subscribers is inevitably going to lead to some job loss down the line. I just like, it was such an irresponsible, just shitty owner move.
Well, it was incredibly ham-fisted. But look, I believe he is broadly correct. I mean, when we talked about endorsements the other day, I totally think endorsements are a bad idea for the reasons you just laid out, Emily, the customer confusion. I also think it is they're an occasion for enormous pomposity and self-importance. They are not, you know, these are not going to be carved into the mountains. The Washington Post endorsement of Kamala Harris is not, you know, it's not the Gettysburg Address. No one is honestly going to give a shit, and yet they treat it as though it's the most important thing that they'll ever write. But of course, and I also think he's right that the alignment of the elite media and the left has been, a friend of mine was saying this to me, has been really good for business. It's been really good for the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Atlantic and the New Yorker to be implicitly aligned with the left, or in some cases explicitly aligned with the left. But it does in fact exacerbate mistrust that these institutions are seen as being speaking for one side of the country. And it is his job as the owner to try to think about ways that it can speak to a broader audience. But yes, it was completely counterproductive in the way he did it. But I don't think he's wrong about why he wants to do it. And I wish him success. I also believe him, I don't know whether you guys do, when he says it wasn't a business decision. And I think the conspiracism about the idea that he, in his case, is sucking up to Trump, I think is probably not fair to him.
I don't know whether to believe him or not. And if he had done it weeks or months ago, it would have been easier to believe him. And so there's this way in which, like, he created the appearance of corruption, which then undermines all of the goals you were just laying out.
He did. On the other hand, if you look at what that paper, the Washington Post, has done, it's been incredibly nasty in its coverage of him, incredibly tough on him and his own businesses. He's allowed that to happen. And it's been incredibly tough on Trump. And it has cost Bezos and his companies billions and billions and billions of dollars in the first Trump administration. And he sat there and ate it in a way that almost no person in the world would have. So I think while it is true that this does create a perception that he is preemptively capitulating, it's also true that the record shows that he's allowed this newspaper to act quite aggressively towards people who could harm him. And those people, in fact, did retaliate and harm his companies. So his own history is pretty decent in this regard.
Here's a question. Does the number of cancellations underscore and support his argument, which is the misunderstanding people have between the reporting pages and the editorial pages. So that people are essentially revolting at a decision made on the editorial pages and punishing the reporting pages.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the thing is people are so on the edge of outrage right now, and he gave them a reason. I mean, honestly, it would have made more sense to cancel one's Amazon subscription than one's Washington Post subscription. I mean, I just really I feel
people will only go so far.
Well, exactly, but it's really upsetting to me
point.
that this is going to end up with the Post having less reach and potentially and less revenue, to actually pay for journalism. It really bothers me. I guess the thing is, John, it's hard to know why people canceled their subscriptions. Did people cancel their subscriptions because the Post didn't go all in for Kamala Harris, or because they felt like Bezos was doing something corrupt and underhanded? It seemed more like a lot of Bezos rage.
Yeah, but Bezos rage, which still, nevertheless, they're hurting the thing that is the counterweight to all these forces that probably make a lot of those people so unhappy.
You know what I think the real lesson of this episode may be, and I hope that people on the left, the educated, moneyed left, think about this if there is a Trump presidency. People on the left may not see their candidate win the election. They can still have a huge impact certainly on American business, should they choose to use collective action. There are forms of a collective action, which is we're going to rally in the streets and we're going to, we're all going to wear nice hats and agree that Trump is terrible for women. And that's one form of collective action. But there's also, we saw with the Bud Light boycott on the right, very effective ways that mass consumer protests can impact and shape corporate behavior and shape corporate attitudes. And I hope that people on the left, if they find themselves on the wrong side of political issues, think about other tools they can use to cause corporations to behave better, cause other institutions to behave better, because they have a lot of money and a lot of rhetorical power, and they can use it to their benefit if they act together.
Can we just go back for 1 minute to the LA Times situation? Because I feel like Bezos created such an uproar that we've sort of forgotten about that. And I actually find that instance to be just as...
that's craven capitulation.
That is craven capitulation. Patrick Souchong, the owner of the LA Times, seems to be auditioning for a job in the Trump administration. And then his daughter, Nika, who wants to position herself as this uber progressive, had, in my view, the gall to claim that, this was really about Harris's stance on the war in Gaza, which just seemed false, totally self-serving. Her dad's no, you had nothing to do with this. And she's this is the one time I have interfered. I mean, that family seems like some bad owners.
Yep. Agree. Has there ever been a week when one has wanted a cocktail more? It's hard to think of one. So,
or a whole bottle of edibles.
Emily Bazelon. Oh, good thinking. Good thinking. Or you're 4 edibles in. What are you going to be chattering in a slow drawl to Mr. Bazelon about?
Well, I have one really engrossing TV show to recommend. I just hope, David, you haven't already recommended it, which is the television series version of My Brilliant Friend, the beloved Elena Ferrante book, which, of course, is a series. And I've only watched the first episode of the show, but I thought it was so good. And it's in Italian, so I had to pay attention to the subtitles, which right now I think is useful, actually, because you really have to watch. And then I also want to recommend a story in the Washington Post, the valued Washington Post, to which I remain a loyal subscriber. It's by Caroline Kitchener, who is doing a really strong job of coverage related to abortion issues in the Post. And she wrote about a woman named Patience Frazier, who was charged with manslaughter under an abortion law from 1911. And it's just a kind of, this is in South Dakota, a really sad and kind of, what should I say? It's just a very sad tale of misunderstanding and distress and a really difficult life that ended up a law enforcement official who knew this woman personally just like got sort of obsessed with the idea that she had murdered a baby, even though there was no evidence for that. And it really wreaked havoc with her life. So this piece by Caroline Kitchener, I think it's called "She Said She Miscarried, Then She Was Arrested."
John Dickerson, 4 Vespers in. What are you chattering about?
I also want, at some time, perhaps at the Conundrum show, a full analysis of what the cocktail chatter would be like if you're having cocktails or if you're having edibles. Because, so I've been told, you could imagine a long conversation about the lint in your pocket if you're, 10 edibles in. Anyway, you guys can think about that for the Conundrum show. Mine is about a cheese heist, which I read about in the beloved Washington Post. Neal's Yard Dairy, which is a London-based cheese distributor and retailer, announced that it had been the victim of a sophisticated fraud and that 950 wheels of 3 award-winning artisan cheeses had been stolen, and the whole caboodle was worth almost $400,000. And these are special kinds of cheddars. There's a Welsh organic cheddar, a Westcombe cheddar, and a Pitchfork cheddar, and they're some of the most sought after artisanal cheeses. And anyway, essentially, the scammer posed as a legitimate wholesaler for a French retailer, and out of like some heist movie, basically took delivery of the cheeses, looking like and performing like a distributor. But alas, they were not. They were probably working for some sort of Russian oligarch who's going to be up to his neck in cheese for a long time, because that's a lot of cheese.
That's a lot of cheese. Neal's Yard is one of the truly wonderful places on earth. I went there as a kid when we lived in London, and I've been back as an adult. And it's this incredible sort of store back in an alleyway in central London, and they will give you samples of cheese till your cheeks are like squirrel-like filled with cheese. And it's the most amazing, delicious, extraordinary British cheeses. It's a heaven. I'm sorry they were victims. My chatter is a hate chatter. The TV show that I just finished watching, I did get all the way through it. Nobody Wants This. Have any of you watched this? Emily, have you watched it?
Yes. Oh, I'm so eager to hear your hate chatter about this.
So Nobody Wants This is a rom-com on Netflix. It's been much talked about, and I'm definitely not the first person to say what's about to be said. Like, I'm probably the 100,000th person to say what's about to be said.
I still want to hear your version.
So it's a rom-com about a sort of podcaster, a woman who does a sex podcast, probably in her late 30s in Los Angeles, who meets cute with a rabbi, extremely handsome rabbi.
A hot rabbi, David.
A hot rabbi. And they fall for each other, and it's about their romance and how nobody wants it and how difficult it is for everybody. It's a 10-episode rom-com. I love a rom-com more than anyone on earth. Love it. I am just shocked at this rom-com. The character played by Kristen Bell, who's the non-Jewish podcaster, is the most
shiksa is the word that you are searching for.
She's the most ignorant woman in Los Angeles. She's apparently never met a Jew, despite the fact that she lives in Los Angeles and is a podcaster. And that's fine. But what is really terrible, Emily, I am sure you agree, is how horrible it is about Jewish women who are presented as uniformly greedy, selfish, materialistic, easily manipulated by appealing to their vanity, hypocritical, henpecking, scheming, sanctimonious. It's a grotesque portrait of Jewish women. And it's just weird how hateful it is towards Jewish women. It is not that way towards Jewish men. It's like it's amused by Jewish men and infatuated by the hot rabbi. But it's a very odd show that has this look. I love my Jewish queens, and you, Emily Bazelon, I hope you felt wronged throughout this show.
Well, what was funny for me about the show is that I was initially like kind of into it. It's funny. And the two of them have some chemistry, the hot rabbi and the blonde Gentile. And there's something I liked how the predicament, so the issue is like, not only is she going to have to figure out how she feels about Jews, she's going to have to figure out how she feels about being like the rabbi's wife. And that fast forwards into the relationship, these big decisions, which normally one would just put off. And I kind of liked that. It did inject some tension. And then I started more and more noticing what you were describing, David. And then, and this is spoiler alert, there's a scene in which Kristen Bell brings like a bunch of, pork into the house. And the mom, like, she's super mean about it. But then the mom, this Jewish mother, is caught eating the pork. And that would never, I was like, okay, you have totally lost and offended me. Like, that does not happen. Like, people who don't eat, this is true for Muslims, for lots of different, if you don't eat something because you have a ritualistic, like, religion-based, you just don't eat it. It's not a thing that like, oh, I'm super tempted and I all along like wanted to put a piece of salami in my mouth. Like, no. Anyway, that really distressed me. And then I was like, this whole show, I think I should rethink my like light affection for it. Yeah.
The other weird thing about their relationship is they're both clearly like old. I mean, they're in their late 30s minimum. And Kristen Bell in real life, I think, is in her early mid 40s for sure. They never talk about kids. Like, they talk about whether she's going to be Jewish. They never talk about kids. Like, that is not talked about at all. And yet I assure you that any relationship like that, whether they're having kids, what the nature of those that would be, how that's going to play out, is going to be as important as any conversation you might have about religion. Anyway, really annoying show. I also want to chatter something that I'm going to be at on Friday night, November 1st. If you're in Washington, D.C., I'm going to be at the Washington Improv Theater at the Studio Theater here in Washington, D.C. on 14th Street. Washington Improv Theater is doing something called POTUS Among Us, which is a improv show about electing a president, but it's comedy, and it is a much more pleasant way, a gentle and much less traumatizing way of experiencing this election. And I'm the special guest. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be doing, but come join me at the Washington Improv Theater on Friday, November 1st.
That sounds fun.
WITDC.org for tickets and info, by the way. Listeners, thanks for sending your chatters our way. Please keep emailing them to us at gabfest@slate.com. Also keep sending conundrums to us at slate.com/conundrum. And our listener chatter this week comes from Jacob in Chicago, Illinois.
Hi, Gabfest. Jacob here from Chicago, excited to join the Multiple Listener Chatters Club. My chatter is an article from Politico by Ariel Wittenberg, How Green Inhalers Could Evade Biden's Drug Pricing Legacy. Pharmaceutical companies are, under environmental treaties, replacing inhalers with versions that don't emit greenhouse gases. And apparently inhalers are a large source of climate pollution. Annual emissions equal around 500,000 cars. The new inhalers would have fresh patent protections and thus evade the price caps in the Inflation Reduction Act. This means pharma can rake in a lot of cash, all while touting their environmental bona fides. This article explores a fascinating intersection of environmental, patent, and healthcare policy, and reminds us that if you're big pharma, no good deed goes without punishing someone else.
That's all for our episode this week. We have a bonus episode in your feed, and it's a doozy. It is exactly what you need to hear. It is how to live well in this next few anxious days, how to spend your time, how to worry in the right way, how to prepare yourself for the election and the aftermath of the election. And that is only for Slate Plus members, however. So if you're a Slate Plus member, congratulations, thank you. And you'll get to hear that. If you're not a Slate Plus member, become a Slate Plus member. You get to hear these episodes. You also get bonus episodes on other Slate podcasts. You get discounts to our live show, and you'll never hit the paywall on the Slate site. So you can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or go to slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Cheyna Roth. Our researcher is Julie Huygen. Julie, I bet, is about to have election day duties because she is an election worker, and I appreciate that she's doing that as a great citizenly thing. Thank you, Julie. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is a senior director. He's the senior director for podcast operations. Alicia Montgomery, who I saw for 12 seconds in the Slate office this week, is the VP of audio for Slate. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We will talk to you next week after Election Day. Whether we have a result, who can say? Who will know?